John and David, I want to thank you both so much for being here to talk to us about the power and the promise of big data in marketing. I think there's a growing consensus that within the world of marketing, data is incredibly important and playing a central role, but a lot of marketers still feel like they're catching up. It's a huge concept to sort of get their arms around. So I'm hoping that your experience working with data analytics, also your experience turning some of the world's biggest companies, including Apple, into some of the world's sexiest companies, can kind of help a lot of the folks in the audience catch up on this idea about big data. So we've got limited time today, and I really just want to dive in. And David, put this question to you first. I mean, you've been quoted as saying that you can help shave 25% off your clients' customer acquisition costs. That sounds great, and you've also offered that you can, give the clients their money back if you can't do that. That sounds great, but is it possible?
Well, we have 850 clients, and we've never had to give the money back. So I think we're proving it can happen. What the truth of the matter is, a lot of it comes from the inefficiency of how marketing works and how most companies don't really understand how to take massive pools of data and make it actionable. Because so many companies collect data, so few companies use it properly. And what we do is we take our clients' CRM data, and as a part of taking that CRM data, we import it into our marketing cloud, and it figures out who their best customers are so we can target people who are going to be incredibly high-quality customers.
I want to talk more about the data analytics space. I mean, Zeta has recently entered that sort of vaunted billion-dollar valuation club, but still seems to be sort of flying under the radar. And I mean, within this space, there are the Adobes, the IBMs, the Salesforces, and also a number of sort of startup companies, some pretenders in there as well. John, I want to get your take. I mean, how is Zeta competing in this space? What's your strategy?
Sure. Well, let me just, because you said we're flying under the radar, we are something less than 1,000 employees. We grew 70% top line last year. We're very profitable, and we are, we'll be well over $200 million. So it just gives you a context of how big data is. If you can fly under the radar, and still be that size. And the point is that in the decades I've been involved with marketing, we've never been at a point like we are today where we can use predictive analytics. In our case, we have 350 profiled names in our database. We go out to a client and we can help them on acquisition of customers, in the retention of customers, in the monetization of the customers, and we only get paid on performance. Right. So, it's kind of like, well, it's estimated that of the data exhaust, in other words, all of this data coming out, that maybe only 2% of data is actually used in any useful way. And that's probably, an outside optimistic number. So we're in the early days of being able to take advantage of this data exhaust and be able to provide predictive analytics. In the case of Zeta Interactive, we're working with some of the largest, most recognizable companies in automotive, insurance, in mortgages, in banking, in telecommunications. So these are credible, well-known companies that we're doing the whole life cycle management of a customer. It's all around the customer.
Right. I want to ask a question for all of the CMOs that are sitting in the audience right now. I'm sure that a lot of CMOs have had to deal with marketing service providers. There's a lot of new players in the space making a lot of promises. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like the emperor's new clothes at the end of the day. I'm sure people can relate to that. So David, I want to put this question to you. What is the biggest lie that service providers tell marketers?
Well, they're going to have to call Salesforce to ask them that question. No, I'm kidding, joking. No, I think that what we talk about, and as John touched on, at the end of the day, when we work with clients, we're only as good as the campaigns we're running. And often, chief marketing officers will get sold this story around building your brand. And, to me, if you look at models like Google and even models like Facebook, the reason they're really working is because you're so close to the transaction. Somebody's got a very high intent to buy, they run a search or they click on an ad, and that then extrapolates out to I'm going to purchase something. Most chief marketing officers are sold on the building of their brand, and as that brand builds, then you'll get customers. And we just don't believe in that in our organization. We believe that you can directly attribute marketing to a transaction in almost any business.
So let's say I'm a CMO and a service provider is telling me, I'm going to build your brand. What questions should I be asking the person who's telling me this?
Well, how do you prove the value proposition of that brand build, right? So just the great thing about the internet and the great thing about digital is the metrics and how metrics oriented it is. Show me.
Right. There's another issue that CMOs are faced with constantly. It's this tension between sort of the creative side and creative agencies and folks sort of more on the data-driven kind of analytics side. And sometimes it seems like there can be a huge gap. I mean, I think it's sort of hard to imagine, the Don Drapers out there approaching a spreadsheet with a lot of glee. John, maybe you could talk about this. How do you bridge that sort of creative data divide?
Well, it's a lot harder to fake it anymore. In the earlier days in marketing, someone could say, I've done a great creative campaign, it's going to help your brand. And the reality is we didn't have really very good metrics to know whether it worked. We could tell whether there was awareness, we could measure frequency, we could measure whether people liked it or not, but we couldn't really tell, did it actually engage people in a way that they made transactions. And the reality is, in the world of data marketing, we can. And what is unique about the world of data marketing is that, unlike the past where you may track maybe a few characteristics, maybe 4 or 5 different characteristics about a profile, today we can have literally hundreds of attributes. You could have even thousands of attributes about a single individual and customized for each individual. And so in our case, we have 300 data scientists and engineers, and they are working constantly with predictive analytics. And predictive analytics, when I went to school in math, we were doing Bayesian statistical modeling, and this is all about probability math. Well, there was nothing practical possible because computers just weren't powerful enough then. Well, now with cloud computing, the affordability, the ability of mobile devices to be able to capture data, to be able to communicate with people, it just changed everything. And so big data marketing has really just come into its own in the last few years. So when you say fly under the radar screen, there are probably companies that are being created now or will be created in the next few years that we don't even know about, and they'll probably have a chance to end up being billion-dollar companies a few years later. It's just growing that fast. It's much different than anything we've ever seen in marketing because it actually enables us to measure exactly what the true value is for the customer. And ultimately, that's what brand building is all about.
Right. I also want to talk about an issue that a lot of sort of non-marketing consumers sort of face with data. I think a lot of consumers are sort of growing accustomed to the idea that, say they make a purchase online, that purchase in some sense will sort of follow them around the internet. And that can sort of feel good, but it can also feel a little bit creepy and ineffective. So for instance, I'm imagining that most of us shopped for flights to Dublin. Most of us shopped for hotels here in Dublin maybe months ago. And yet to this day, we're still getting some emails, we're still getting some banner ads that show flights to Dublin, hotels to Dublin. So it feels like data is smart, but not smart enough. What'll it take to make it smarter? David.
So it's interesting because we talk about the creepiness of following people around after they buy something. And statistically, people transact between 1% and 3% of the time they actually get to an offer. So by doing it that way, you have a 97% likelihood of hitting somebody who is interested in a product but didn't buy it. Now, we actually do it only for 60 days. So we're not the guy following you for 8 months. But
thank you.
Yeah, sorry. We have about 350 million active people in our database today with an average of 3,000 attributes each. So if you look at that, as people are transacting or as people are researching things or as clusters are being built, we kind of go from email to mobile to social to display. You build this ecosystem. It's something that, it's one of the reasons we don't do it as long. It's even as a consumer, I looked at a watch just a couple of months ago, and an ad for that watch popped up on every device I had. I was like, great, cross-channel, this is fabulous. I was impressed they were able to identify me outside of the ecosystem until I'm still seeing it 6 months later.
Is machine learning going to play a role here?
Well, we have a bunch of patents around machine learning, and if you think about machine learning, it's simply the first step before that kind of the creepiness of artificial intelligence, whether you believe it's going to save the world or end it, depending on who you're listening to. You know, and it goes back to something John talks about a lot, right? Most of this can be drawn back to Moore's law. The faster the processors get, the more data you can crunch. So here we're talking about big data on stage today. I just was at a data summit a few weeks ago. Nobody even cares about big data anymore. It's now all about fast data. The ability to process data in a millisecond. Now, I remember when we started years ago, a report that would take an hour today takes a second. And the question is, how do we get it down to real-time decisioning in a millisecond?
John, I want to put this question to you because you seem to know a thing or two about creating brand loyalty and having customers come back to back to back. I'm thinking about Pepsi and I'm thinking about Apple. And I think what's clear to a lot of marketers is the promise of big data to sort of acquire new customers, right? I think people generally understand we've got this data, we'll segment by each population, and instead of spraying the entire population, we'll go to the people who will be more receptive to this message. But I think what's less clear for a lot of marketers is how to use data to retain customers and to build brand loyalty. How does that happen with data?
Well, one of the big advantages we have today in the world of data marketing is that we can test and try and test and learn, and most of our clients don't run just one creative campaign. They may be trying out 100 different messages a day. In other words, you can modify things dynamically, get feedback, what works, what doesn't work. We're watching it all the time. And when you talk about machine learning essentially is about pattern matching. So the technology that is being built today, if you look at what Google is doing, now Alphabet, what Facebook is doing, these companies are investing in a whole new generation of processors that aren't optimized around just how fast can you compute, but they're optimized around pattern matching.
Right.
And that is going to take data marketing to an even more advanced level. And it's all because machine learning is going to come integrated into it so that the individual chief marketing officer in many cases, is also in charge of the technology in their firms.
Right.
And that's very different than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. And the reason is that companies are understanding now that the power has shifted from the incumbents with their reputation and legacy businesses to now customers are paying more attention to the opinions of other customers.
Right.
And the result is that you've got the world of social media actually becoming totally integrated into the world of data marketing. And all of this stuff, as David said, is happening at really a magical speed, and it's all affordable. And it's just dramatically changing everything that I ever learned when I grew up in marketing. So it isn't the way we built Pepsi, it isn't the way we built Apple in the early days. It's an entirely new way of building loyalty, going in, find out, for instance, we can use machine learning to begin to see what attributes do we see with the population of people with similar attributes before they start to leave a brand. You can even anticipate the probability of someone dropping their loyalty, and then you come in and you customize a special offer just for them.
Right.
Well, none of that was possible even 2 or 3 years ago.
David, you mentioned multi-channel, and I want to talk more about that. My big question here is, there's a lot of startups in the audience, and maybe you say there's a startup that's got, a really great social media presence. Is multi-channel for that person? Should they be going over to email? Should they be going over to search? Is it right for everyone?
So we believe multi-channel is effectively mission critical for any large corporation. If you're a startup and you're dealing with a tighter tighter budget, you're going to be more limited on what you can do. But I think John touched on something that is really important. Today, you can set up your own big data platform effectively for less than $10,000. And you're doing things that when we started out, 7, 8 years ago, would literally cost $1 million because of the cloud, because you can process there. The trick and the great thing about the internet is you can test everything. You can test social, you can test mobile, you can test email, you can test display. You can try every RTB out there. You can build different clusters. You can build different audiences. And once you find your audience, which the easiest way to start with an audience is on social, is if you figure that audience out and you figure out who your buyers are, you can then very cheaply or inexpensively check out some of the RTBs, check out search, and begin to understand how to build an audience yourself without having to come to a company like us to do it.
John, did you want to add something?
Well, if I could leave the audience with just one big idea, and you didn't remember anything else I said, it would be this, that all of us are familiar with the business plan process. Every company goes through it. It takes a lot of time, effort, money to put a business plan together. And the reality is, it's always a look back at where you were, and then it's a projection forward of where you want to go, and then it's a negotiation of who gets what resources between where you have been and where you want to go. The reality is that with data marketing, with business analytics, with machine learning, suddenly we can rethink that entire idea of planning and forget about the business plan. It's just a budgeting process. Sure, you got to have a budget. The CFO wants you to have a budget. But the reality is, think of the customer plan.
Yep.
Think of your industry in terms of what is the really big customer problem that you think needs to be solved. Think about how you might solve that, and then all of your metrics in your customer plan are around the customer, the engagement of customer. What's it cost to acquire a customer? What's it cost to retain a customer? Why is it that Sprint, for example, keeps hemorrhaging money and T-Mobile keeps making money? Why? Because one is churning out their customers and the other isn't. How do you monetize your customer? So if you start to think of your business around a customer plan, you're not looking back like a budget process or a business plan does. You're looking forward at a big customer problem you want to solve. Well, today with data marketing, we actually have the tools we can do that. Not just from Zeta Interactive. We happen to be one of the leaders in the world, but there are other companies that also are focused on big data marketing too. And the reality is that the tools to be able to build customer plans that deliver measurable results are happening, and they weren't here 3 or 4 years ago, and they are clearly here today, and they're going to only get better and better. So this is a very, very big space for marketers.
Before we go, I want to talk about email, because email has been a huge topic of conversation here at the summit. We've been talking about, whether email is dead. And so I need to put this question to each of you for our marketers out there. Is email dead? David?
Absolutely not. I mean, we believe that email is among the most important methodologies and least expensive methodologies for communicating with customers. From a CRM perspective, and we announced this week that we bought the CRM division of eBay. We spun it out of eBay and we bought it and merged it into our company. Email is probably the most important way companies speak to their existing customers. If you think about creating new customers, it's part of a solution, not the solution. But it's very difficult to run a CRM campaign if you are not able to email your customers. Imagine if you had to go out and buy marketing every time somebody created a transaction. Where you transact, you get an email, you then get another email that's probably going to offer you something like what you've done before. Most of the companies we work with, and once again, we have 800 clients, over 400 of which are in the Fortune 1000, these guys make most of their profit on selling existing customers more stuff. The best way to do that is email.
John, email, is it dead?
Well, email is going to be around for a long time, but email is getting smarter. I mean, the email that you just would blast out to a list, that is kind of yesterday. But smart email that's tied back to data analytics, smarter and smarter analytics, in combination, with other media. It isn't just email. It's many different ways that you can reach customers.
Right.
But email is still a fundamental part of the system, and you'll see that for many years ahead.
And John, I need to give the audience what they want. I'm sure they want to hear about how marketing has changed since that 1984 commercial at Apple to today. What's changed and what's remained the same?
Well, just to give you a quick background, Steve Jobs recruited me to Apple, not because I knew the first thing about computers, but because we had developed something at Pepsi during the Cola Wars that enabled us to actually pass Coca-Cola and become the largest selling consumer packaged good in America. And it was called experience marketing. And it was embellished in a campaign we called Pepsi Challenge. And Steve loved that campaign. And he said, I'm building a product that's going to be all about experience for the users, and it's for non-technical people, and they're going to do creative things. Eventually it became desktop publishing and the Mac. Well, when we launched the Mac at the Super Bowl in 1984, we never showed the product. We never talked about technology. We set an expectation of the experience. And so that is still a very valid way to do things. And Apple, to this day, is always setting these incredibly high, noble cause expectations. So Apple is the master at that. But the world has changed even since the days of what we were doing in high tech. And now we're starting to see that everybody, whether they're a high-tech company or any other kind of a company, can now start to think about marketing and give an experience that is customized to the individual, knowing exactly what you think are the attributes of that individual that may influence their behavior. So it's no longer just a like button.
Right.
It's a buy button.
Right.
And it's a smart buy button. And that's just the evolution of how we've been able to see marketing go from, the days of 3 networks on television, big mass audiences, to the kinds of things we did in early days of launching Macintosh, which have still stayed on to this day. But now we're in the era where we can actually personalize, customize it right down to the individual and know what we think that person is going to be influenced by, not just people like them.
Right. And John, we are over time, but I want to ask one last question for the audience. The Apple movie, what do you think, quickly?
Apple movie. This is about the early Steve Jobs, when I knew him in his 20s. And I probably knew him better than anyone on the planet, because for several years, Steve and I were really, really close friends. Steve never cared about being liked by other people, but he wanted people to love his products.
Good to know.
This movie is entertainment. A lot of it isn't factually accurate. They have me in a suit. I haven't worn a suit in 40 years.
I don't see a suit right now.
I've never seen you in a suit.
And it really is not fair to Steve Jobs, because Steve was a much better person. He was fun. People loved working for Steve Jobs. And the movie makes him out to be kind of a monster in the relationship he had with his daughter. Steve was an imperfect person, as many of us are, most of us are, particularly as we're young. He had an imperfect relationship with his daughter, and the movie is largely about that relationship. But there was a lot more to Steve Jobs, and the older Steve Jobs obviously matured, like most of us hopefully do. So don't go to see it if you think you're going to see the whole Steve Jobs. You won't. If you want to see good entertainment, Aaron Sorkin, Danny Boyle, it's good entertainment.
Great. Well, why don't we end there? John and David, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And Web Summit, thank you.
Thank you.